Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I've Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And welcome to another Monday Mini where we're just going to be mad and sad and angry. Let's put a timestamp. Today is March 7th, 2025. This is something that, well, let's just jump into it because it's a lot. It's a lot, okay? And I feel like we can't talk about the downfall of humanity in the U.S. without talking about the continued rise of Christian nationalism. And just recently, I came up on a newish theory, so new to me. I didn't realize this was being touted. I should have, but I think I try to avoid anything like with Christian nationalism because it's so tainted to me. Well, the whole Christianity is tainted to me on a whole, but Christian nationalism in itself. But it is a newish theory within extremist Christianity, and it's the theory of the sin of empathy. So, as with most current affairs content we've been publishing, again, trigger warning for all the stressfulness of a world gone mad, but specifically religious trauma. I think we're going to have to open up to add more to the series, Anney, and talk about the actual results of how Christian nationalism has been able to take control of the U.S. government and us watching it in real time. Like, we knew it was coming, which is why we started talking about it. The level and the speed that it has come is overwhelming, almost like to the point that we are all frozen in fear, I feel like, or I am. Maybe that's just me. Interestingly enough, when we were talking to Molly Conger, who you'll hear in the future, prediction, is going to want to listen to this.
Prediction.
Just kidding. I don't think the future. But with that, like how we were talking about, we still need to talk about Project 2025. And she's like, it's too late. I was like, yeah, but we still need to talk about it. And we don't want to. But with all of that, for this Monday Mini, I wanted to take a quick look at this theory and why it continues to be brought up. First, a reminder, empathy, according to Merriam-Webster, is, quote, the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another. And sympathy, because this is very related, obviously, is a feeling of sincere concern for someone who has experienced something difficult or painful. And with that, they say the difference is sympathy and empathy both involve feelings of concern for someone, but empathy goes beyond a feeling of concern to include an active sharing in the suffering person's emotional experience. So, we love a good definition, and I think it's always good to be reminded of what this is. And this is what we're referring to. So this is from 2021, and this is one of the first articles that pop up when I try to look this up about the sin of empathy. A far-right Christian nationalist pastor by the name of James White came onto the internet, specifically Twitter, to talk about the sins of empathy. In it, he talks about his ideas that bringing in someone's trauma and making others feel sad or guilty is selfish and poisoning the church. According to his site from Alpha and Omega and Apologia Church, he wrote what he had originally tweeted, which is, hey folks, Jesus endured all the trauma needed to accomplish redemption and reconciliation. Dragging your emotional trauma into the fellowship and making everyone else feel guilty for it is the perfect poison for the body. And this is capital body. Get over yourself. It's all about him, not you. And in the second tweet, it says, when you start with man as image-bearing creature of God, you can understand why sympathy is good, but empathy is sinful. Do not surrender our mind to the sinful emotional responses of others. So he goes on to justify his tweets with the following from that blog. Quote, now, fact of the matter is, I packed more than sufficient context into those two sentences to have stopped 95% of the absurd blowback that came my way if people were not already infected with the, quote, empathy is required for everyone and is how you are loving, balderdash, of a rapidly dying culture. I mean, check it out. So this is still his quote. I made the context that of creation with man as the image bearer, the exact opposite of the secular worldview, should have been a context settler. 2, I asserted a direct contrast between the goodness of sympathy and the sinfulness of empathy. 3, I then made it clear what is sinful about this use of empathy. It involves the surrender of our minds to the sinful emotional responses of others. Just so y'all understand, secular means non-church, non-Christian. And I think people already know that. But just in case, in my mind, yes, people know this, but I grew up in church lingo. There's so much in his, I said what I said in his blog. Y'all, I have once again corrupted my search.
Oh, no.
With all of this, just so you know. So now I'm getting things that I'm like, no, but why? So, FYI, don't look these up if you don't want that type of extremism in your search results now.
You should go in there and clean that up. You can do that.
I do need to. It's on my personal one, too.
Oh, no. Yeah, you got to fix that up.
Anyway, and to give more context of why empathy is the problem, he further explains, quote, "So what is the problem with empathy today? We are, in fact, told to weep with those who weep, but that assumes those who weep have a reason for weeping that is in line with God's revelation. We are not to weep with a drug dealer who accidentally drops his stash down the storm drain in New York City. We are not to weep with a bank robber who botches the job and ends up in the slammer. We are plainly to exercise control even in our sympathy. We are not to sympathize with sin, nor are we to sympathize with rebellion or evil." And again, they are the authority of what is sin and evil as a context here. Of course, here we could talk a lot about the hypocritical nature of how we should also not allow a rapist, convicted felon, not only lead the country, but put him on a pedestal that many see him as directly appointed by the same God, or how often churches will hide predators by allowing forgiveness and empathy to be the lead so that the predators can continue to lead in the same churches. Don't worry about that part. We're not talking about that's not real sin, right?
Yeah.
Of course, we could also go into the deeper level of Calvinism, and that's a whole division in itself when it comes to religion and denomination, and Calvinism being essentially you can't do and it's God's plans, so why even try it? People have been ordained previously, preordained into this role that you're in, so why do even try, essentially? There's a weird level of seniority and supremacy when it comes to that conversation. I'm about to get people mad at me. I don't care. Come at me, bro. So, no, it seems the sin of empathy is when we are empathetic to homosexuality, which he uses as an example of, quote, the great empathy commandment that has been used for the, quote, degradation of Christian morals and ethics. More from that blog, quote, 60 years ago, it was almost unthinkable that Christian people would, by a majority, think homosexuality a, quote, gift from God. But that is the case today. Why? Empathy. And this is still his quotes. He's saying, walk a mile in their shoes, consider their life, enter into their emotional experience, and enter into is capitalized. Then it went from simple homosexuality to the redefining of marriage, now polyamory, polygamy, and with 2015, every form of gender-destroying, quote, experience. You must empathize. You must, quote, enter in or you're unloving. Already, the push to empathize with those who naturally experience, quote, intergenerational love, pedophiles, is in the academy and the culture. Marrying your cat or your Siamese fighting fish is just around the corner. Just empathize with the experience, validate it, then submit. Okay. And it should be noted, as Anney, you talked about before, he uses every stereotypical offensive defense against, not even stereotypical, just outright wrong defense against homosexuality, pedophilia, marrying your pets, etc.
I'm so interested about a Siamese fighting fish. I don't know if that's a thing.
I can't even say it out loud because I don't know what that is. Did he make something up and he just wanted to be racist about it at the same time?
It's quite possible. That feels like that guy's MO, and I don't know him.
We don't know him. We don't know this man. Not sorry to that man. If you are a person who knows about fish and that is actually that is a thing, please send us that picture because I need to know what this is and who's being racist in this naming.
Yeah. Wow.
We laugh so we don't cry. I read it so you didn't have to. Yes, they do every trick in the book in order to make you feel insane for being kind and compassionate. I mean, to be fair, this is one step away from hate the sin, love the sinner mentality, which, by the way, is so condescending. There's really like nothing I can say to that. But they do. He hits on every nerve of like, what's next? You're gonna marry your favorite shoe and say that's your like, if that, y'all owe me presents to the people that I bought your heterosexual wedding day gifts to, and y'all owe me money, so I'm gonna marry my shoe so you can. That's gonna be taken out of context somewhere. But like he goes through every level of like insulting manner to say homosexuality is so bad and leads to other sins. But by the way, I have never heard anybody, especially from like those who struggle to come out, saying this was a gift from God, like saying that they've learned to love themselves.
Yeah.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
But the struggle and the fight and the like constant way to prove their humanity, that a lot of people would not necessarily say that.
No. And I've told the story before in middle school. In middle school, I would pray to God, please, you did not make me gay.
Right.
Please let that not be true. I was scared of it.
Right.
And it's really sad to look back now. But no, I never considered it a gift from God.
Right.
I think like the other part of that conversation is there's a lot of like, well, why would God make me like this?
Right.
Are you telling me I'm defective?
Right.
Clearly that's what this guy thinks.
Yes. And obviously all gay people are in polyamorous relationships. All of them. Yeah,
because we're so sexual. Even the asexual ones.
We laugh because we don't want to cry, y'all.
Yeah.
So, and with that, White is having this conversation in 2021. So, obviously, he has been ascribed to this. And the idea kind of has kept spreading, if not just growing, and has become political. 2 books are or have been written with this idea. One by Allie Beth Stuckey titled Toxic Empathy, How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion.
Wow.
By the way, her website is bright blue and so lovely, and she is exactly what you would imagine as a Christian white woman with all the makeup. Anyway, a bit from her website, toxicempathy.com. They write, in Toxic Empathy, Allie Beth Stuckey argues that empathy has become a tool of manipulation by left-wing activists who bully people into believing that they must adopt progressive positions to be loving. She explores the 5 most heated issues through which toxic empathy is deployed: abortion, gender, sexuality, immigration, and social justice. Progressives use catchy mantras to present their perspective as empathetic, like abortion is healthcare, love is love, or no human being is illegal. But in each case, they ignore the other side of the moral equation. For example, abortion is presented as compassionate for the woman, but what about the human life the procedure kills? The book isn't about killing empathy. It's about submitting our empathy to God's definitions of love, goodness, and justice. Stuckey exposes the logical pitfalls and moral consequences of toxic empathy, equipping Christians with research-backed biblical truths to dismantle the progressive lies that have permeated our culture and our church. So I love that the only thing that they can argue about in the actual summary is abortion. They can't talk about immigration and social justice much in itself, because I'm like, what?
Yeah. And I mean, going back to the hypocrisy, it's just, it feels so, are you being a compassionate Christian? Like, this doesn't feel like you're listening to your self-talk.
Right.
Oh, God.
I mean, of course, that level of like, you're killing a baby, that rhetoric in itself has been used forever.
Yes.
And then telling people, well, if you've been aborted.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like, it's just so hypocritical because, you know, like these are just phrases like abortion is healthcare, love is love. There's a lot more nuance to that stuff. There's a lot more things behind that. There's a lot of research backing that stuff, in fact. But to just use it as like, they're trying to make me care about someone else, and here's why it's bad.
That's sin. How dare you?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. I have not read this book. Everything comes from just directly from the site and my opinions and my assumptions. Like, let's say that on what this is going to be. I'm sure there's going to be tales of crimes committed by refugees or whatever that happen, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to the crimes that have happened by white men. Mm-hmm. Let's just be honest. I mean, again, our president, a felon.
Yep.
So the one that is coming out this year is by Joe Rigney, titled The Sin of Empathy, Compassion, and Its Counterfeits. So Rigney is actually credited with coining the term in 2019 for his church. So he is the one that people are saying he's the one that began this. In his blog, he uses a C.S. Lewis book, Screw Tape Letters, to get this point across. So here's a bit from BaptistNews.com. Writing to his imaginary friend Wormwood, Rigney advises, quote, by elevating empathy over compassion as a superior virtue, there is now an entire culture devoted to the total immersion of empathy. Books, articles, and social media all trumpet the importance of checking one's own beliefs, values, judgments, and reasons at the door of empathy. So in this article written by Mark Wingfield, which, by the way, he must really be in this as well, because his articles kind of keep popping up for me in BaptistNews.com. And he is a Christian, by the way, in this conversation. But he wrote this in 2021, and he goes on to explain how Rigney now sees empathy as a sin, that empathy trumps any religious ideal and belief, therefore has become an idealized emotion used as a weapon against Christians. This is what he's saying, Rigney is saying. And here they often argue the need for sympathy, he said. And when I say they, I don't mean Wingfield. I mean Rigney and those who believe this idea. Interestingly, we in social work believe people, and I believe people in there, like in the therapy world, also talk about the differences of sympathy and empathy, and sometimes used in conversation of what a sociopath and a psychopath can experience due to the lack of empathy. Like, without it, you're probably a sociopath or a psychopath or a narcissist, somewhere on that level where you cannot understand other people, and therefore you are so involved in yourself that you do not care about the harm you cause because you don't have empathy.
Yep.
That sounds like an overarching statement. So, of course, I'm not saying everyone. That's not the case. But we're saying that in this conversation, that can be one of the things that people look at and be like, oh, it looks like he's lacking empathy. That explains why he did it this way, because he could not understand the humanity of it. And again, not for all people, because I've met people who have admitted they couldn't empathize, but they sympathized and understood the good and wrong in this situation. So leave it at that. And I'm sure the theories have moved. It's a lot more complex than that, but it's still something to note. Mm-hmm. So moving on. According to the different articles that talk about this big debate, many Christians disagree full-heartedly with this take and have even left churches due to this take. So Wrigley's church was actually, I don't know if you know who John Piper is, but he wrote the book Desiring God. And when I was in my Christian world, that was huge. That was huge. There's a lot of shame I have in that realm of the world. So for those of you who may have known me from my years of Christian antics, I am so sorry. I have changed. I am so sorry. But with all of that, people in that church actually split with him, Rigney, and Rigney left that church because it became such a huge thing. They had this whole 105th anniversary that they had to pause because of this debate that he had started on their site. So again, not all Christians feel this way. One such person who is pushing back on this doctrine includes Scott McKnight, and he is quoted in Wingfield's article saying, from the best I can tell, these denouncers of empathy are distinguishing the virtue of compassion from the potential vice of empathy, he writes. The former means to suffer with, the latter to suffer in, or to fill with and fill in. The former is rational. The latter appears to be less rational and perhaps irrational. At least in their constructions, it's okay to suffer with, but not to suffer in. Of this view, McKnight says, this may be the most unwise piece of pastoral theology I've seen in my life. Pastors without empathy are not pastoring.
Dang.
Right. I'm like, okay. See, like we're going to give both sides to this because I don't believe it's everyone. And it's not. Here's another quote from that article. Quote, Shane Moe is a licensed marriage and family therapist and trauma treatment provider in private practice in the Twin Cities area. He has extensive experience treating mental, emotional, and relational health concerns in the Christian community. He sees in the empathy as sin crowd a fear of vulnerability. These advocates, quote, appear to assume that empathy inherently makes one untethered, that one can't experience empathy towards someone else without losing oneself, getting hijacked, or sort of becoming the other in belief or practice. Moe's talking about the fear of vulnerability from this group of male believers specifically. So he goes on to say within that article, yes, allowing ourselves to experience empathy can make us more vulnerable to, gasp, the influence of those who think differently than we do, he explains. And if one lives in a perpetual state of spiritual hypervigilance or fear of potentially being wrong or corrupt, and thus with a deep-seated existential anxiety surrounding theological, ideological differences and change, one might consequently come to see empathy as a threat. And as we've talked about this before, this theory could be an issue of control within the religious world. And so Moe concludes in his interview with this comment. If someone is saying you can't experience empathy without being compromised by another person, there's a good chance they're projecting out of their own psychosocial emotional boundary deficits, lack of emotional intelligence, or absence of self-differentiation, Moe warns. There are reasons some of my clients' family members who exhibit narcissistic traits and who have engaged in consistent patterns of spiritual and psychological abuse toward my clients have been attracted to this empathy is a sin teaching and to this church. It feeds perfectly into their narcissism and psychological dependence upon maintaining power and control. Now, that's something that we were talking all throughout our religious trauma episodes about what this is. It is not about spirituality. It's not about beliefs. It's not about saving people. It is about control. And this narrative fits in perfectly. If they were losing people because people were like, wait, why are you being mean?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem Christ-like. They were losing people that way. So they're like, no, that's a sin. You're being fooled. Don't care. You can feel sorry for them, but being sorry for them is enough. Pity is enough, but you shouldn't be accepting of anything. So within this conversation, it's going to become more and more of a defense within the right-wing religious conservatives. When Episcopal Bishop Mary Ann Budde came on to speak at the inaugural prayer service, Trump supporters were upset as she made a plea to the new president for mercy. With her words, quote, "Let me make one final plea, Mr. President," the soft-spoken bishop said from the pulpit of the Washington National Cathedral. "I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgendered children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. The vast majority of immigrants are not criminals, calling them good neighbors and faithful members of religious communities." So that was a quote from the Daily Kos, who were just like, Republicans are mad. They're mad. And we're going to actually talk a little more in a different episode about her. But like that was it. That was her speech was about unity and coming together and knowing that this is a really hard time. But having the president there, she's like, let me just ask you, please think about these people. And she is very soft-spoken. Like there was nothing threatening, yelling, or any of that. She just quietly said this.
Nope.
Nicer than I could.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously. So the right-wing community came out swinging, including tweets and posts reminding their followers, quote, "Do not commit the sin of empathy." So Ben Garrett went on saying in his tweet, quote, "This snake is God's enemies and yours too. She hates God and his people. You need to properly hate in response. She is not merely deceived, but is a deceiver. Your eye shall not pity." Like he full on tells them to hate her.
Wow.
For saying, be merciful.
Hate. Wow. That's not what I remember during my tenure at church.
And I believe he's a deacon and writes for a church as well. So, as a former believer myself, this idea has baffled me. I have thoughts, so many thoughts, but it's like baffling to understand why they would do this. But at the same time, you know why they would do this. We know why. We know the play. We've already talked about it. We made it an 8 to 10 part series. We know why. But after using emotion as a tool to rein in their group with fear and hell, they now have to turn that around to remind people to not feel too much, because to truly love is something that makes many people see the truth. So, like, maybe I'm saying that too optimistically, like people who really realize that what's happening here, you know, that maybe that's the point of like, oh, wait, this seems off. This seems off. Again, maybe I'm being too optimistic. But like we noted, there's a lot of people who are like, this is not it. This is not it. This is not the Jesus I know. Interesting side note, some have stated that Rigney has made statements implying marital rape does not exist. And I believe he said that in sermons, but I could not find the sources specifically. And I will say this was a quick research. Like, it took me less time to do this than my typical episodes, but there's plenty of conversations out there. Mm-hmm. So what I did see is that groups are using his book coming out, as well as his conversations before, his blogs, because he's written many papers on this, to remind their followers that women are very vulnerable to empathy, and that is why they need to be controlled. From yoursourceone.com, Dominic Bonney talks about a sermon by Grace City Church pastors who apparently Rigney has mentored, and it has many conversations with them, where the church pastor states, empathy almost needs to be struck from Christian vocabulary, McPherson said. That's the pastor. Empathy is dangerous. Empathy is toxic. Empathy will align you with hell. And it's women who are especially susceptible to feeling empathy. That's why men need to control who they are in contact with. It's not ungodly for a man to speak into who his wife is friends with, who she can hang out with, who she listens to, McPherson says. Women can be vulnerable to friends and those she has a history with. And it's a husband's job to control those relationships lest she participate in, spread, or listen to gossip and slander against the church. Like McMullen, who is another pastor, connects gossip to empathy and frames them as largely female sins. And that seems to be the beginning of an hour-long sermon, continuing on with the explanation of women being the weaker sex, women who are strong causes divide in relationships. They are the ones who plant the sin of divorce. And that's why there's so much divorce. Like, this is all within the sermon. Of course, within all of this, we have the everlasting sin of impurity, because you got to add that in there somewhere. So in a medium.com post, Dan Foster writes, quote, according to Rigney, compassion is good because it allows you to care while maintaining control. Empathy, however, is dangerous because it involves stepping into another person's experience so deeply that you risk losing perspective. But this isn't just about perspective. It's about purity. Under Rigney's logic, the real danger of empathy isn't just that it clouds judgment. It's that it might lead us to feel too much for the wrong people. That if we sit too long with the grieving, the suffering, the broken, we might start to understand them. And if we understand them, we might start to care about their pain in a way that disrupts our theology. That's the fear. So this whole level, which is coming out in force, is, again, mainly due to the whole lack of asking for empathy from an administration that has none, asking for mercy. There's a lot happening, and the underlying reasons are different for different people. But as we continue to talk about how Christian nationalism has come into power, we have to understand some of their tactics and how dangerous their rhetoric is. The loss of empathy means a loss of humanity. Again, it's very obvious by the many articles and pleas from the other Christians about how dangerous and wrong this narrative is that many Christians do not believe in this idea. But many are ignoring it for the sake of unity or just the sake of being comfortable. And that is so dangerous. Not holding your own people, their own people, to a standard and calling out what they see as wrong. And that is a problem. And I say this as I have a whole family. I am scared of losing my family with this type of rhetoric. And the minute they speak this rhetoric to me, I know it'll be over. Like, that it's going to end so many things. That means I've lost my second family, literally, like my biological family and my adoptive family. But it has to be, at the very least, they need to understand how uncomfortable this is. That they need to see how oddly, like they went from people who, my mother is the queen of empathy, to the reason why I was adopted in the first place, can't understand how this is so damaging just because she just ignores it and says things like, they don't really mean that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what they really mean.
Yeah.
And for the same people who sit here and going, yeah, but I'm fiscally conservative. That's conservative. That's why I voted that way.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I know our listeners, you probably are like, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. But I think it's something to know that we have to know exactly what is being said.
Yeah.
And why it's dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, again, especially given where our politics are, we have to pay attention to a lot of really terrible stuff, unfortunately. But yes. Whoa. Listeners, if you have any thoughts about this, please let us know. You can email us at hello@stuffmonevertoldyou.com. You can find us on Blue Sky at Mom Stuff Podcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff One Never Told You. We're on YouTube, we have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff One Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.